Shoulder pads, MTV, and bad haircuts. These are some of the things that come to mind when I think of the 1980s. But underneath the surface level of fun and bright colors, there was a darker undercurrent of social and cultural change afoot. The 80s were a decade of transformation, subsequently prompting an existential fear in much of America despite apparent economic gains for many people. One of the ways this fear manifested was in the strange hysteria known as the Satanic Panic.
Stories of devil worship and satanic cults corrupting young minds.
Unbelievable crime at the hands of satanic cults.
This collective freakout would cast a heavy shadow on witches and witch communities for decades to come. Like the Salem witch trials centuries before, or the 50s version of this in McCarthyism, the Satanic Panic was built on false allegations and was grown to a fever pitch by a climate of fear that took hold among the populace.
Purposes of this study, we will focus on the number 666 and its use in the Universal Product Code.
But what was the underlying cause of the Satanic Panic? Why did it take hold in the 80s and not the 70s or the 90s? And how did this culture of fear influence the films, TV shows, and books that featured witches during this decade? So strap in, pump up your sneakers, and let's go back in time to the 1980s to find out.
Doc, I'm from the future. Warm yourself by my fire.
Powers they never dreamed they had.
Slimy, slithering succubus.
The 1980s was a time of rapid change for the American middle class. There was so much cultural anxiety around increased crime, stranger danger, and new frightening and misunderstood diseases, primarily AIDS, that contributed to a triggering in the collective unconscious. The nuclear family was also transforming out of the need for a dual income household. More women started entering the workforce, necessitating huge numbers of young children being left in daycares for the first time. I think it's significant that the Satanic Panic centered around false allegations of child abuse in daycare centers. It makes me wonder if this was in part a manifestation or a hallucination among many mothers who were struggling with this change in role from child caretaker to economic provider. In previous decades, some of the most popular films, such as Rosemary's Baby, The Omen, and The Exorcist, featured children being corrupted by occult influences, and I wonder if the Satanic Panic grew in part out of this fear generated by these movies among mothers. But all this fearful save the children rhetoric really just masked the underlying prejudice and hostility to change that proliferated in the 1980s. Additionally, like a black hole, the Satanic Panic pulled many aspects of culture into its orbit. Really, anything adults were resistant to began to be attributed to Satan's growing influence among the young.
Realize that 80% of all toys on the market have occultic influence, and these are the most popular. And do you remember those verses in the book of Revelation about the flying beast with the riders on them?
This could actually be taken from Revelations.
Famously, Dungeons and Dragons was believed to cause young men to turn away from God and engage in demonic ritualism, with even one child's death being falsely attributed to Dungeons and Dragons by their parents.
A town meeting to discuss whether Dungeons and Dragons should continue to be played in their schools. The suicide of a 13-year-old Putnam boy has once again fanned the controversy.
Likewise, the goth fashion trend and heavy metal music were all thought of as corrupting influences among the pure and Christian youth of America. Eventually, this mass hysteria reached its climax with a series of satanic ritual abuse cases that led to dozens of wrongful homicide convictions, with many imprisoned until very recently. The Satanic Panic wasn't the first, and it won't be the last time that the occult community is scapegoated by society. And unfortunately, we witches often get wrapped up in the quagmire of negative media attention. So how did this growing fervor affect the media climate when it came to witches? Well, we know witches and witchcraft often get incorrectly intertwined with Satanism in news and the media. Though when we look at the popular witchy movies of this decade, we don't actually find that the Satanic Panic had as much of a significant impact than one would expect. All of the classic witchy archetypes make an appearance in movies during this decade. We have Cassandra, the seductress witch in Conan the Barbarian, Ursula, the evil spellcaster witch in The Little Mermaid, and we have Alexandra, Jane, and Suki representing the female empowerment witch archetype in The Witches of Eastwick. There were also a few wild cards that appeared during this decade. Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, showed us that witches can be sexy, goth, and campy all at once.
She's everything you've ever wanted in a movie. A woman and a casserole.
On the other side of the spectrum, we see a more wholesome side of witchcraft in Kiki's Delivery Service, where we see that witchcraft could be an avenue for self-growth, community building, and growing maturity. There were several other witchy children's movies that came out this decade as well. One based on a series of influential books structured around a magical academy featuring three friends, one of whom is smart and sensible, and the other a practical joker. And together, the three of them go through school while being plagued by their snobbish, highborn, antagonistic classmate. Any of this sound familiar? The Worst Witch was based on an influential book series from the 70s and may have impacted a future popular series about a magical academy. You may think that the 90s were the decade of the teen witch, but that emphasis began here in the 80s with the aptly titled movie Teen Witch. This movie helped pave the way for later teen witch movies and TV shows like Sabrina and The Craft.
You can make anything happen.
Break a leg, Kiki!
That are simply bewitching.
Though it wasn't all light and fluffy witches that defined this decade. There were several 80s horror movies that featured powerfully terrifying witches such as Inferno and Devonsville Terror. A weird example was Halloween 3: Season of the Witch, which famously used witches instead of featuring the franchise antagonist Michael Myers. Though despite these few horror movies, overall the 80s films showed us a wider and more nuanced perspective on the roles of the witch in society than we saw in previous decades. Also, some of the most popular witchcraft books came out during this decade, such as Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner by Scott Cunningham, and Buckland's Complete Book of Witchcraft. These books are still viewed today as foundational to read for modern witches. Of course, most of the books published during this decade were about Wicca and Western European forms of magic. Unfortunately, you would need to fast forward a few more decades before we would begin to see non-European witchcraft and folk magic traditions being represented on the bookshelves. Even though the books and movies of this decade tended to not be too dragged down by the Satanic Panic, witches themselves will forever have to contend with the prejudice that resulted from this media storm. Luckily, we witches tend to be pretty strong and capable people and are pretty good at overcoming any prejudice that comes our way. So, what came next for the witches of America? I recommend checking out my video, Witchcraft Through the Ages, the 90s, to see how witchcraft evolved and changed in the following decade. I'll leave that link down below. And if you enjoyed this video, please click that like button and consider subscribing to my channel. Also, let me know in the comments your favorite 80s witchy movie, and also let me know which decade you think I should cover next in this series. This video, like all my videos, are really made possible by my patrons. If you enjoy my content and these deep dives into witchcraft and paganism and want to support my channel, I'll leave the link for my Patreon down below. By joining, you also get access to my Discord community where you can chat and share resources with fellow witches and pagans. So I really hope you enjoyed this one. It took me a long time to create and edit, but it was really fun to do. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.